Hello and welcome to the Druid Expanse. I'm Etch the Quack and I hope you're having a less quack day than myself. Today we're going to be talking about the Curse of the Worgen and how it may relate to the Shadowlands. This series starts with an observation that seems a bit too obvious to be a coincidence. That observation is the Worgen Curse literally mimics what the Covenants are doing to souls in the Shadowlands. If anything, the Worgen Curse is a more effective and accelerated version of the process. If a person is afflicted by the curse, they will slowly lose themselves, and unless they have a stupidly powerful will, or drink specific moonwell water and complete the ritual of balance, they will lose themselves to the curse. Now, at first I thought this might be a coincidence. Turns out though, if you go back and read the Curse of the Worgen comic series, a lot of current events and lore start to fall into place. I also have to say, if you were after a perfect example of cross-media storytelling, read the comic series and play the Worgen starting experience. The interplay between the two is near seamless. Anyway, the amount of context given by the Curse of the Worgen about what is currently going on in the Shadowlands, and even parts of BFA, is staggering. I mean, for example, how did Painfairy know Sylvanas was serving death? For all intents and purposes, Druids up until the Drost didn't seem to have any overt connections to death. At the same time, the Drost seemingly came out of nowhere, and were quite obviously more balanced than most of the Druids. They actually balanced life and death, if not being a bit more aligned with death. The answer is subtly implied in the Curse of the Worgen. You see, after the Worgen were created, Painfairy formed the Cenarian Circle, the main entity of Druids we've basically been allied with since vanilla. This group was specifically created to fight the Worgen, and as a part of its creation, Painfairy established some traditions of Druidism. Now, what's interesting about this is these traditions were established to ensure the creation of the Worgen and the misuse of Druidism never happened again. However, I think an unforeseen side effect of these traditions was a slow fall from balance when it came to Night Elf and Druidism, and an eventual focus on nature alone that was probably spurred on by Painfairy's respect and admiration for Cenarius. I am implying with this statement, by the way, that the Druid of the Pack form, which is specifically related to Goldrinn, a wild god, has more to do with death magic than it has to do with nature magic, and originally Night Elven Druids did have a connection to death. However, over time it was slowly faded out because they couldn't control the pack form and because of what happened with the Worgen. In the same vein, I think the Drost were in an identical boat going in a different direction. Throughout Drostvar there are these tablets that go over the history of the Drost. These tablets imply the Drost were savage and had a thing for living blood sacrifices. One of these sacrifices, and the one that seems to have ensured the Drost's control over the forest, was the death of the stag. Not Malorn, but possibly a creature with similar importance, as there is a tablet that seemingly depicts Ulfar, the leader of the Thorn Speakers, swearing allegiance to a white stag and a black doe. You can see what I assume are remnants of these two deer walking around Drustvar. However, their real importance to me is their parallels to Tyrande and Malfurion, who are also the rulers of their respective forest, and until quite recently, matched the black and white aesthetic. I mean, you could even say the bear is supposed to be a nod to Brawl Bearmantle and his allegiance to Malfurion. Either way, the death of the stag and the savagery of the Drost seemingly pushed them in the opposite direction of the Night Elves when it came to Druidism, but similar to the Night Elves, they are using the same magic and never really lost their connection to the other half. Druidism in World of Warcraft has seemingly been closely related to life and death magic since the very beginning. This brings us back to the implication I just left hanging. Goldrinn, the Wolfbar god, connected to the Emerald Dream, is related to death and in turn the Shadowlands. I know, a bold statement, but I wasn't joking about how much info this comic series fills in. In Curse of the Worgen we learn of an old Night Elven legend about how Goldrinn could never control his bloodlust, and how the full moon can be seen as a loon glaring down upon Goldrinn in judgment. Now, at first, this is just a story. However, when you add the context of a loon's power enabling the Worgen Curse to exist in its current virulent and transformative state, the fact it's been confirmed a loon has something to do with the Shadowlands, and the rather obvious similarities between the Covenant transformation processes and the Worgen Curse, a story suddenly starts to sound more like an observation. In Curse of the Worgen, Alpha Prime, the first of the Worgen, created this crazed cult around the idea of purity of essence. The idea being the Worgen Curse is not a curse, but a gift allowing one to purify the soul. Deluded as he was, Alpha Prime was right about one thing. The Worgen curse basically forces an individual's essence, spirit, to shift and mimic that of Goldrinn, eventually changing the person completely unless they manage to stop the process and gain control. Now imagine a highly virulent curse like that in the Shadowlands, where it's reasonable to assume Elun's power, the power that created the curse in the first place, is everywhere, and you have populations that by default should be so susceptible to this curse that if it broke out, it would probably wipe out the Shadowlands in days. Honestly, glaring in judgment seems like an understatement. I think Goldrinn was kicked out of the Shadowlands because in comparison to the physical universe, uncontrollable bloodlust and feral rage are probably one of the highest taboos of the Shadowlands that gets you kicked into the maw. But coupled with the essence curse, there was probably no safe way to get Goldrinn into the maw, let alone imprison him, and so he was probably given to the Titans. And yeah, I know. I should probably explain that statement. So something I'm probably never going to forget, thanks to Gizmo from the Shinies and Lucydos Discord, is that the Orcs have recognized Goldrinn as a deity since their time on Draenor. Now, the reason this is important is because this initial worship likely happened before he was kicked out of the Shadowlands and tied to the Emerald Dream. My reasoning here is, Orc culture, by default, may be ruthless and savage. However, even the Orcs understood uncontrolled, reckless, feral rage and bloodlust was not something to be praised and venerated. So, if Goldrinn was in a feral state since day one, I doubt even the Orcs would have willingly worshipped him. This isn't mentioning Goldrinn's positive traits, which generally revolve around controlled ferocity and savagery, as well as an unyielding spirit. Keep that last part in mind, it'll be important later. What this lore seems to imply is something happened to Goldrinn. Something pushed him over the edge and turned him into a completely savage and mindless beast, which saw him fall out of favour with Lhok. Enter Lycanoth. During Cataclysm, we brought back Goldrinn and other ancients to defend Hyjal. To do this, we had to cleanse the Shrine of Goldrinn that had been corrupted by the Twilight's Hammer, and defeat Lycanoth, who at the moment I assume was the darker aspects of Goldrinn made manifest. Kind of similar to what happened to Varian when he was split, except Lycanoth has no redeeming features. Now, the reason I'm bringing up Lycanoth is simple. He was created and brought into existence by the corruption and machinations of the Twilight's Hammer, servants of the old gods, and in turn the Shadow, who attempted to invade the Shadowlands and failed. The Shadow, who also has a magic that is highly corruptive. The Shadow. This list goes on, but I think you get the point. Goldrinn, and quite possibly all of the wild gods outside of the August Celestials that ended up on Azeroth and tied to the Emerald Dream, may have been the casualties of the Shadow's attempt to invade the Shadowlands. And before you mention Freya choosing these creatures after the Titan's invasion of Azeroth, I'd like to point out, I know she did, and at this point, I'm convinced that conflict is one and the same. I think the reason the Black Empire was so thoroughly blindsided and defeated by the Titans is because on top of fighting each other on the surface of Azeroth, the old gods were also attempting to corrupt the Shadowlands, probably battling the Covenants we're going to be allies with. So when the Titans suddenly turned up from the Great Dark Beyond, the old gods faced a war on at least two fronts, one against the Shadowlands and another against the Titans. A war they couldn't win. Now, to clarify, in an older bit of content I speculated Yogg-Saron tapped into the Shadowlands. Overall, the speculation attempted to explain why he proclaimed himself the god of death, and why Sauronite seems to have the properties of shadow and death magic. At the time, I assumed he did it out of desperation. However, after hearing about the Void's invasion, and possibly figuring out the likely reason why the Shadowlands is so important, I feel like I can safely say I was wrong. The old gods, all of them, were probably attempting to invade the Shadowlands at one point or another. If you'd like to know some of the locations the old gods were likely trying to invade from, this old map may give an insight. However, I would highly suggest watching this content by Accolonn. I don't agree with everything in the speculation, but I do agree with a lot of it. And without it, I personally wouldn't have remembered this map and some of the locations on it. So, just in case I've gone a bit too deep into the pond, Goldrinn was originally of the Shadowlands. He was likely a part of Ardenwald. However, remember how I mentioned one of his well-known traits was being unyielding? Well, despite the aesthetic of Maldraxxus, there is a slim chance Goldrinn may have originally been connected to the Zone. If anything, Goldrinn may have been the original protector of the Shadowlands before Maldraxxus, if not possibly being the original ruler of Maldraxxus, possibly giving a bit more reason for why Draka ended up in the zone. Either way, the Old Gods and the Shadow invade, corrupt Goldrinn and I assume a lot of major players in the Shadowland, specifically the first Wild Gods, except the August Celestials. This corruption probably turned these deities into walking bioweapons that, upon striking, biting, and or just being within proximity of others within the Shadowlands, spread the Shadow's corruption. This virulence probably prompted the creation of the Scourge and Maldraxxus as we know it. As in, if you're dealing with what equates to a potent bioweapon, why not create an army that's not only unyielding, but can also resist the Shadow, most forms of corruption, and wield some of, if not the most potent and deadly toxins in the universe outside of Fel magic, as in toxins so potent they can practically harm everything in the known universe. I should also add this here. At present, I do believe this invasion happened just before the Pantheon arrived on Azeroth, as it lines up too well. However, it could have also happened when Yogg-Saron was allowed into the Emerald Dream, when Fandral Staghelm decided to be stupid and created Vordrassil, letting Yogg-Saron and eventually the other Old Gods into the realm. As in, to this day, there hasn't really been much of an explanation as to why Yogg-Saron let the other Old Gods in and gave up the dream to N'Zoth. Anyway, the Old Gods are invading the Shadowlands, then the Titans turn up, and we get the fall of the Black Empire, the day is saved, everything is peachy, except for one thing. Those creatures from the Shadowlands are still corrupted, and so is Azeroth. Now, I am 100% certain under normal circumstances, the Titans would have just deleted the corruption without a second thought, re-originate the planet and be done with it. However, the Titans want Azeroth, and they specifically want her uncorrupted. Something that's true of a lot of IRL grand plans and schemes is almost all of them require some form of necessity and inspiration, whether the inspiration be topical or not. The reason I bring this up is because I think the Titans, upon realizing the Shadowlands existed, or upon realizing how it worked, specifically the aspect pertaining to how the Covenants can change souls, the Titans figured they could do the same thing in the physical universe, where spirit is a lot more rigid. I believe this necessity to save Azeroth and the inspiration of the Shadowlands is what spearheaded the creation of the World Forges, locations like Uldia and Pandaria, and pretty much everything we've seen on Azeroth. The Titans have been trying to recreate the Covenant process in the physical universe, with the aim being to cure Azeroth of her corruption on the benevolent end, but also, most likely, shape her into a living weapon on the malevolent end. This explains the experiments on Loa, as well as the creation of the Emerald Dream. The lower experiments are probably the early tests, literally the equivalent of IRL animal testing before human trials are attempted. As for the Emerald Dream, well, like in all good science experiments, there are going to be failures and partial successes, a lot of trial and error, and where you obviously don't destroy your failures just in case the results prove to be useful later, what do you do with your partial successes? Well, you put them in a place they can be observed, preferably a place similar to their natural habitat that, at the same time, is highly regulated. And hell, if there is a habitat you wish to rebuild after any form of mass destruction, you usually isolate the area, reintroduce certain plant life or completely new flora when possible, then wait. Everything will eventually regrow as it was, or anew, as long as the area is looked after. Then you reintroduce the fauna to solidify the process. I think the Emerald Dream was a part of the Shadowlands and was heavily quarantined by the Titans. Altered, then used as a pen for the experiments that showed promise after the Titans were finished experimenting on them. The Emerald Dream and Ardmord were likely one in the same place at one point in time. It explains the excruciating difference in scale between the Emerald Dream and the Shadowlands when they are compared to each other, as well as the reason why the corruption within the dream never faded. Because I haven't mentioned this yet, but seemingly it's impossible to get rid of this corruption completely. If anything, it's very similar to what happened to the Gurubashi with Hakar's corruption, as in, the shadow can be repressed and made nearly undetectable. However, because of the exposure, the susceptibility seemingly never goes away. The want for a perfect shadowless being doesn't seem to be possible. and probably shouldn't be possible. I also need to put this out there now. I am not saying there is no Greater Dream / Lifelands. What I'm saying is similar to how the other zones in the Shadowlands are influenced by magics and other forces, the Emerald Dream follows the same rules. However, in comparison to the other zones, has been isolated and saturated in a massive amount of life magic to negate the shadow magic present. Now, coming back to Goldrinn, he is one of the corrupted spirits of the Shadowlands that became an experiment of the Titans. He obviously survived whatever process he was put through, and it was bound to the Emerald Dream. From here, most of the stories surrounding Goldrinn take place, and the Worgen curse is created. A curse similar to the one in the Shadowlands that was created because of an extremely unlikely set of circumstances. There is just one very interesting thing about all of this that doesn't seem to match up. Goldrinn is a white wolf. Now, you can assume the black colour of the Worgen is related to the Shadow's corruption, and for the most part, that would make a lot of sense. However, there is just one problem that doesn't line up with that theory. Thoradin, the first king of the humans, built Stromgarde where it is because in a dream, his father, wearing a black wolf pelt, told him of a land where his people will prosper. Eventually, Thoradin found a place where a black wolf was roaming around an area similar to what his father described, and established Stromgarde. The rest is history. Now, where you can definitely put this down to superstitious humans, after the Born Samedi cinematic, I highly doubt this story is that simple. Thoradin's bloodline is the bloodline of Arathi, and was carried in Varian and now in Anduin. This bloodline being connected to Goldrinn in part explains Varian being the prophesied chosen of Goldrinn in Wolfheart. However, it doesn't explain the colour change, as it's reasonable to assume Goldrinn at this point would have been cleansed of the corruption. This is where three very interesting locations start to become very important. The first is Uldum and the Jackal Watcher Satesh, who is apparently related to Chaos. Now, if this Watcher was supposed to reflect Goldrinn during his feral state, I could definitely see it. It would explain the concepts related to Satesh. However, if you've watched Dawn of the Sun, where I go into explaining who Raj and Isaset are in detail, I make the point of saying there is no way the Titans would create a Watcher that depicts the Elder Gods. And I maintain the idea of that statement here. There is no way the Titans created a Watcher in the image of something corrupted by the Elder Gods. So, the question of this first location is, what is Satesh made in the image of? The second location is Fenris Isle. If you've watched that other important question, you know I mentioned the idea the Armani may have let something loose from Lordaeron during the Troll Wars. I didn't say what, however, if you're catching on to where this is going, it definitely has something to do with the naming of the Isle and the reason why the Menethil and Arathi bloodlines seemingly have a connection to the Shadowlands. The last place of interest is Gilneas. Now, Gilneas' connection to the Worgen and Goldrinn is pretty cut and dry, as most of it is explained in the Curse of the Worgen comic series. The Great Trees, and assumedly the World Trees, have a calming effect on those that are consumed by rage. It gives context as to why Hyjal is so important, and why Freya would have bound the most likely cleansed spirits from the Shadowlands to the tree, the idea being to observe and avoid a relapse. However, there is one thing about Gilneas that is different to the other locations. There is no specific name attached to the region, yet it is still attached to Goldrinn. Now, you could just chalk that up to how the Worgen were trapped near Tal Doran. However, I would also ask, of all the great trees, why was Cenarius so certain Tal Doran and its Emerald Dream equivalent, Dal Ronir, were the only trees able to soothe the Worgen's rage? It's almost as if Dal Ronir was specifically aligned to Goldrinn. So, what am I getting at here with these three specific locations related to three specific wolves? Well, instead of there just being one major wolf spirit that was corrupted by the shadow, I think a pack of wolves may have been corrupted, or at the very least, three major wolf spirits were corrupted, and for some reason I think there were only supposed to be two corrupted wolves. The possible proof of what I'm talking about comes in the form of the Bear Lords, Ursol and Ursok. The Bear Lords seem to be based off the constellations Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. Ursa Minor being one of the IRL constellations that turn up in the Ulduar Forges. The reason these two may act as proof is that if Goldrinn follows the same patterns as the Bear Lords and is based off a constellation, I'm willing to say he was based off the constellation Lupus, which literally translates to wolf. Here's the thing though, Lupus isn't the only canine-related constellation in the sky. Canis Major, or Sirius, which contains the dog star, and is known to represent a dog, and Lepus, which can depict a dog or a hare. Assuming all of these constellations are being used in a similar fashion to the Ursa constellations, and are inspirations, I think it's likely we're going to find out there are at least 2 other major wolf/canine gods in World of Warcraft. One that is related to Satesh, and may have always been connected to the magic of chaos, and another related to Fenris Isle. That's not Fenrir from the Halls of Valor. And to be frank, of these possible wolves, I would suggest being shit scared of the one that's possibly connected to Fenris Lake. Because even if you minus the Norse mythology reference, in that other important question, I explain how the Lordaeron throne may have been a closed portal into the Shadowlands, specifically the Maw. I also go through a bunch of origins that may have been related to its creation and hint at the idea the Menethil and Aetheri bloodlines may have been cursed and attached to its closure, raising interesting questions about those who are attached to the bloodlines. Within this theory, it raises the question about how these connections may affect Anduin's future. One of the origins of the throne I didn't mention was the possibility Lordaeron may have been one of the incursion points Yogg-Saron used to enter the Shadowlands, or at the very least was one of the locations N'Zoth and Yogg-Saron were fighting over, as it's likely Lordaeron was on their border during the Black Empire. Because of the properties of Saronite and Yogg-Saron's general proximity to the location that would eventually become ICC, I think it's quite possible that at one point Yogg-Saron was attempting to control the Maw during the Black Empire. Now, whether he succeeded or not, or even made a deal with the Jailer, I am uncertain of. But in the case of Lordaeron, I think it's quite likely he may have possibly let something feral out of the Maw to attack the Titanforged, and or upon his defeat, a breach was left open. Either way, the throne was needed, and if it's ever broken, we may get an equivalent of Norse mythology's Fenris running rampant on Azeroth. I'll also add now, I do understand Galakrond and the story of Galakrond in almost every way mimics the aspects of the stories related to the IRL Fenris. I do have one possible explanation behind that, however that's for another time. In conclusion, the Worgen Curse and Goldrinn have deeper connections to the Shadowlands, more than one might think. On top of this, if they do, it's highly likely they prove that the Black Empire was attempting to stretch its influence into the Shadowlands, and was the catalyst for an alliance between the forces of the Shadowlands and the Titans. The eventual result of this alliance was the Titans' experiments to recreate the soul-changing process of the Shadowlands in the physical universe, which saw the shadow-corrupted spirits of the Shadowlands quarantined on Azeroth and in the Emerald Dream, a location inside the Shadowlands that was sealed off because of the Shadow's corruption and was heavily saturated in nature magic in an attempt to cleanse the area. It's also possible Goldrinn may not have been the only wolf/canine spirit of the Shadowlands, and may have at least 2 counterparts, one of the Shadow and Chaos which the Titan Watcher Satesh is based on, and another of the Maw, which Fenris Isle may have been named after, and may have connection to the Menethil bloodline or the bloodline of Arathi. Thank you for watching.